The bulb above the hallway mirror had been flickering for days, and I had finally gotten tired of waiting for anyone else to notice it, so I dragged the old aluminum stepladder from the garage, balanced it on the uneven tile by the front door, and climbed up with the replacement bulb in my left hand, and a quiet hope that the thing wouldn't short out again like last time. But when I slipped on the ladder, Brian caught me by the waist to prevent me from falling. However, he held on much longer than necessary, making intense eye contact that felt inappropriate and deliberate rather than helpful. When he finally did let go, it wasn't gradual. It was precise, deliberate, like he had decided to cut a thread, instead of letting it unravel, and without a word he stepped back and disappeared into the living room, leaving me standing there on the third rung with my heart pounding harder than I wanted to admit, still holding the bulb in one hand and the breath I hadn't let out in the other. Brian had arrived 2.5 weeks earlier with a duffel bag, a toolbox, and a casual explanation about taking a break between jobs after some vague falling out with a contractor friend in Portland. And although he was only supposed to stay a few nights while figuring things out, he settled into the guest room like he already knew every creak in the house and didn't bother pretending he was in a rush to leave. My husband was at the hospital most nights, either covering extra shifts or prepping for some late-night surgery, and Brian was just always around, sometimes in the kitchen before I got there, sometimes already outside trimming hedges before I even noticed the shears had been moved from the garage, and sometimes just standing in the hallway like he had walked in mid-thought and forgotten what he'd come to do. What started bothering me wasn't how often I saw him. It was how much he saw, how much he noticed, without ever making a show of it, like how he switched the coffee maker to brew without sweetener before I ever said a word, or how he never turned the TV past volume 11 when I sat down to read, or how he glanced at the books I left open on the arm of the sofa and somehow knew which ones I'd reread more than once. That morning, I came downstairs still half asleep, and walked into the laundry room wearing an old pajama top that always hung too loose across the chest, and those thin cotton bottoms I should have thrown out years ago. And just as I reached for the detergent, the door opened behind me and Brian stepped inside, stopping immediately like he hadn't expected anyone to be there and said, "I thought it was empty," but didn't step back, didn't apologize, just stood there in the narrow room with his eyes not exactly on me but not anywhere else either. I folded my arms across my chest at first, instinctively, then realized it wasn't shame or fear that made me pause. It was something tighter and colder, something like static in the base of my neck, and I slowly dropped my hands, because the only thing worse than being seen in that moment was pretending I wasn't. Later that evening, after dinner, and after another long text from my husband saying he'd be working late again, Brian found me in the den where I was folding laundry and said casually, almost like he was commenting on the weather, "You know he doesn't really see you." And when I didn't answer, he added, "He lives like no one else is in the room, like you're just part of the furniture." And I wanted to shut him down, to say something like, "Don't," or "That's not your place." But the words stalled behind my teeth because there was no anger in his voice, only something unsettlingly close to pity. The next afternoon, he was fixing the curtain rod in my bedroom, balancing on the edge of a stool with one arm stretched above his head, and when I passed by with a basket of clean sheets, he touched my shoulder, not urgently, not accidentally, but deliberately, and said, "Can you hold me for a second?" And I knew what he meant, and I also knew he could have asked for the screwdriver or the rod itself, but he didn't, and I set the basket down and reached for him, steadying him with both hands as he worked above me, and I didn't let go immediately, not when the screw went in, not when his hand came down, not when I should have stepped away, because the stillness between us had started to feel like its own kind of gravity. That night, as I cleared the plates and he rinsed something at the sink, my husband called to check in, and after I hung up, Brian said, "He's strange, but he's kind, right?" And I just nodded because that's what you do when someone makes a statement they think is safe, even when what's inside you isn't agreement but pressure, like the air gets heavier when the truth isn't said. And just before I turned off the kitchen lights, Brian placed a flathead screwdriver on the table and said, "If anything's jammed, I'm good at loosening things." And he looked at me, not like he was joking, but like he was waiting to see whether I understood what he really meant. I didn't answer right away, and maybe that silence between us said more than any smile or dismissal could have, because I didn't laugh, and he didn't explain himself, and when I reached for the screwdriver to move it aside, it felt heavier than it should have, not because of the weight itself, but because of the way his hand had rested beside it on the edge of the table, fingers still curled slightly, as if they'd just released it with hesitation. There was something in the way he lingered near my space, not physically pressing, not invasive in the usual sense, but present enough to create a subtle charge in the room that made me aware of my every movement, how I reached for the faucet, how I bent to load the dishwasher, how I tucked my hair behind my ear when I noticed him still standing there. He never crossed a line you could define, not exactly, not in a way that would make sense if I tried to explain it out loud. And yet there was no denying that my skin registered his nearness, like the way you feel humidity before a storm, not uncomfortable yet, just enough to raise something underneath the surface that refused to go unnoticed. When I went upstairs that night, the hallway light was off, even though I was certain I'd left it on, and as I passed the guest room, his door stood slightly, open with the faint sound of an old blues song playing low, something with no words, just aching guitar, and I caught myself slowing down, listening. Not because I wanted to intrude, but because it felt like the kind of moment that was offering something unsaid. I went into my bedroom and closed the door with more care than usual, set down the laundry basket and stood still for a minute, hands on my hips, listening to the quiet that seemed thicker now that the music was gone, wondering if he'd seen me hesitate outside his room, or if he had just turned it off because he sensed I was too close. The next morning, the curtain rod in the hallway was fixed, even though I hadn't mentioned it, and the tools were gone from the corner where he usually left them, and in their place was a note written in the blocky print he always used. Nothing personal, just tightened both ends, but it was the fact that he'd noticed it needed tightening in the first place that stayed with me through the rest of the day. Later that afternoon, I walked into the kitchen and found him already there, sleeves rolled up, scrubbing something, at the sink like he belonged there. Like this was his house too, and when he looked over his shoulder and said, "Did you sleep okay?" It wasn't casual small talk. It was intentional, as if he already knew I hadn't and just wanted to hear it confirmed in my voice. I nodded, gave him the kind of half-smile people give when they don't want to answer fully, and opened the fridge just to do something with my hands, trying not to think about how he was now behind me, close enough that I could feel the warmth of his presence through the back of my shirt, not touching me, not speaking, but there in a way that was too quiet to be ignored. When I turned around, he was already stepping back, wiping his hands on a towel, asking something mundane about whether we had more garbage bags, and I answered with a nod even though I hadn't processed the question, too focused on the way he was looking at the cabinet but not really seeing it. That evening, my husband came home just before midnight, dropped his keys on the counter with a tired sigh, and rubbed his temples like he'd been fighting tension headaches again. And I asked if he wanted tea or if he'd eaten, but he just shook his head and muttered something about rounds being brutal, eyes already closing as he leaned against the wall. We sat at the kitchen table for a few minutes while he scrolled through emails on his phone, and I picked at the edge of a placemat, and eventually he looked up and said, "Brian's a little odd, I know, but he's good, just needs time to find his footing again, so just be patient with him." And I nodded slowly, giving the impression of agreement, while a pressure built inside my chest that had nothing to do with patience, and everything to do with attention. I hadn't asked for, but could no longer ignore. Because I wasn't waiting for Brian to leave, and I wasn't counting the days until the house returned to normal, and I wasn't brushing off his behavior as harmless quirks the way I might have done with someone less observant, less persistent, less exact, because I noticed him noticing, and that made everything different. I wasn't confused about what I felt. Not exactly. It wasn't attraction in the way people like to reduce things. It was something closer to alertness, like I had become the center of someone's focus without ever volunteering for it. And that shift made even the smallest moments feel deliberate, like the way he dried the mugs and set them upside down exactly how I did, or how he always left a light on in the hallway when I stayed up reading. And when he placed that screwdriver on my table again 2 nights later, this time without a word, just a glance and the faintest pull at the corner of his mouth that never quite became a smile, I didn't laugh, not because it wasn't funny, but because something about it felt too real to treat lightly. And even though I told myself not to read into it, I also didn't put the screwdriver away. I just left it where it was, like a placeholder, like a quiet signal between two people who hadn't spoken out loud, but had already begun to understand each other too clearly. The kitchen was still wrapped in that soft pre-dawn silence when I walked in barefoot, thinking I had the house to myself as usual, expecting nothing more than the slow gurgle of the coffee maker and the cold linoleum under my feet. But when I flipped on the light, Brian was already there, leaning against the counter with one hand wrapped around a half-filled mug like he'd been waiting for someone to join him even though his posture said nothing out loud. He didn't look startled or even particularly awake, just met my gaze with that same unreadable stillness he always wore when he was about to say something simple that didn't match the weight behind it. And when he spoke, his voice was soft but confident as he said, "Old habits, I guess. 6 a.m. always felt like the beginning of something clean. And even though the words were casual, his eyes didn't flick to the coffee pot or the newspaper I picked up, or the clock on the wall ticking steadily behind me. They stayed fixed on my body, lower than they should have, lingering for a beat too long just above my hips. Not rude, or overt, but so intentional that I felt it more in the tightness of my breath than in my skin. I didn't say anything as I moved past him, grabbed a spoon from the drawer and reached for the oatmeal I never particularly liked but made out of habit, only to drop the spoon when the edge of the drawer caught my wrist and sent the utensil clattering to the floor, a sharp sound in the morning quiet that made both of us flinch slightly before instinct pulled us both downward at the same moment, and suddenly his face was right in front of mine, so close I could see the stubble on his jaw and the darker ring around his irises and the barely there twitch at the corner of his mouth before he said quietly, almost into my skin, "There's fire in your eyes, and your husband doesn't even notice it's burning." The air around me shrank as I stood up too quickly, grabbing the counter for balance, pretending I hadn't heard him, or that the words didn't settle inside my chest like heat from something I hadn't invited. But my heartbeat gave me away, pounding hard enough to drown out the low hum of the refrigerator behind me. I didn't see him again until late afternoon, when I walked into the garage to look for the folding table we kept for backyard barbecues, and he was already in there, standing by the tool shelf with his arms crossed and an expression that didn't shift when I approached, except that he moved just slightly into my space as if to test whether I would step back, and before I could even register the discomfort or the draw of it, the door creaked open and my husband stepped in with tired eyes and a suspicious pause, glancing between us with more calculation than greeting before asking flatly, "What are you two doing?" Brian answered before I could, voice smooth and unbothered, as he said, "Shelf stuck again, just helping her fix it." And the tone he used was dry, almost rehearsed, the kind of delivery that sounded neutral unless you were listening, closely enough to hear what wasn't being said. My husband nodded slowly, too slowly, like the gears were turning behind his eyes, but he hadn't yet decided whether the noise they made was worth pursuing, and after a long beat, he walked out again. But I saw the way he hesitated in the doorway, glancing back with a flicker of something that wasn't quite suspicion, but definitely wasn't trust either. Later that night, I found a photograph placed on the corner of the dining table, not framed or folded, just laid flat like something casual but too deliberate to be innocent, and when I picked it up, I recognized the image instantly. It was me and my husband standing outside that Italian place in San Diego the summer after. We married, my smile caught in mid-laugh, and my hand gripping his arm like I meant it. But before I could process why Brian had it, he appeared beside me and said, "You were really smiling then, weren't you?" The question made me grip the photo tighter, almost snatching it away from the table as I stepped back and tucked it under a magazine, and he just gave me a half smile, that subtle sideways one that never reached his eyes, and said, "Got it." Like he didn't need any answer because my reaction had already given him what he was looking for. We ended up on the couch. That evening, after my husband fell asleep on the upstairs bed with a heating pad on his lower back and an unfinished email draft still open on his laptop, and I sat on one end of the sofa pretending to read while Brian sat on the other with a baseball game playing low on the muted screen between us, and though there was a pillow resting between us like a polite boundary, I shifted slightly, letting it slide down beside me so slowly it felt almost accidental, even though I knew he noticed because he didn't glance over, didn't change his posture, just stayed exactly still, as if that silence between us was what he'd been waiting for. While we were on the couch, Brian touched my knee and moved his hand upward along my leg. When I didn't stop him, he made a comment about waiting, making it clear he was pursuing something inappropriate and was patient about it. I sat completely still, heart beating like it wanted to climb out of my chest, eyes fixed on the muted television even though I wasn't seeing anything at all. And in that stretch of quiet, while his fingers rested right where he'd left them, not pressing or coaxing, but very much there, I realized I wasn't holding my breath because of fear, but because I didn't want anything to move forward too quickly. Didn't want to break the spell or admit to myself how long I'd been waiting to be noticed in exactly that way. He pulled his hand back eventually, slowly, with a kind of precision that made it feel less like retreat and more like a statement. Like he was saying something through what he didn't do. And when I finally looked over, he wasn't looking at the screen or me. He was looking at the spot on the pillow where my arm had rested just a moment earlier, as if memorizing the absence. The term next day passed like it had been pressed flat between two heavy hands, normal on the outside but filled with tension that stretched through each hour like fishing line drawn too tight to see unless you were really paying attention. And even though I kept to the routine, made coffee, wiped down the counters, answered my husband's check-in text with the usual emojis, everything felt different because I had started counting the pauses between glances and the spaces between words. That afternoon, while looking for a set of spare towels in the hallway closet, I ended up pulling the wrong handle and opening the door to the storage pantry that Brian had been reorganizing earlier that week, and as I stepped in to adjust the baskets he had labeled with black Sharpie, he appeared behind me without a sound, blocking the light slightly as he stepped just inside the frame and reached over me to straighten a loose hinge. I turned to say something, I don't remember what, but before the words made it to my mouth, his fingers closed gently around my wrist, and the warmth of that grip traveled through my skin like a current, not forceful, just anchored, just present. and I stood there in the dim space between shelves and cardboard boxes, staring at him as if waiting for something to make it real or unreal. Then my phone rang. It was my husband. I answered with my eyes still locked on Brian's, hand still in his, and my voice came out too even, too practiced, as I said, "Hi, babe. Yeah, everything's calm here. Just folding some laundry." And in that moment, with one hand pressed to my ear and the other still held in his, Brian leaned in slightly and whispered, just loud enough for me to hear but not enough to carry, into the line, "You lie beautifully." I smiled, or at least something like it, and I hated how effortless it felt to slide the phone back into my pocket and not let go of his hand right away, how natural it felt to continue existing in a space that wasn't supposed to exist at all, and how little guilt managed to find room in my chest when everything else felt like it was pulsing. That night, sleep came in waves, but never fully stayed, and sometime past midnight, I slipped out of bed, careful not to wake the man who had never once asked why I stared at the ceiling for hours and padded out into the hallway, not with intention, not with a plan, just with the kind of restless stillness that drags your feet when your mind won't settle. I didn't expect to see anything or anyone, but I heard it, steps, soft but deliberate, echoing down from the opposite end of the house where the hallway curved slightly toward the guest room and the back stairs. I stopped. So did the sound. We both stood there, frozen in that hallway carved out by shadows and half-moonlight leaking through the slats of the window above the stairs, and then I saw him, Brian, standing there barefoot, wearing that same dark t-shirt from earlier, his face only half lit, but his posture unmistakable, shoulders squared, eyes steady, arms by his sides. Neither of us moved, not forward, not away. There was no smile, no smirk, no attempt at conversation or excuse, just a stare that was too patient and too familiar, and the kind of silence that only comes when two people know that saying something would change everything, and not saying it might preserve what was still unspoken. The clock on the wall ticked loud in the distance, each second driving deeper into the thick space between us, and I knew without a doubt that he wasn't going to leave first, that he wasn't going to turn around and pretend it hadn't happened. And I also knew I wasn't either, because in that moment, I wasn't trying to return to normal. I was trying to understand how long I had already left it behind. My hands stayed at my sides, my feet didn't shift, my breath remained slow and quiet like I could control the entire moment by controlling my rhythm. And when the hallway lights flickered once from the power timer resetting, neither of us blinked, neither of us flinched because we were both already too deep in the moment to let anything so simple pull us out. I eventually turned away, not because I wanted to break the stare, but because I needed to breathe again somewhere else, in a room with less heat and fewer shadows. But I felt the weight of his gaze follow me down the hall and into the darkness behind the bedroom door, where the silence that waited wasn't peaceful anymore, but sharp and full of memory. The morning air was still cool when I stepped onto the back porch with the laundry basket pressed against my hip, wearing nothing more than my thin robe that clung slightly to my skin from the leftover steam of the shower. And as I moved toward the line strung between the posts, I saw Brian coming up the steps from the side yard, shirt unbuttoned halfway like he'd just rolled out of bed and didn't care, or maybe cared too much in ways that didn't match the time of day, his chest barely covered, his breath visible in the early light, and his pace slow enough that I couldn't pretend I hadn't noticed. I didn't say anything when he stopped just a foot from me, eyes flicking over the basket then back to my face, as if the clothes weren't what caught his attention at all, and I stayed still, too still, holding my breath without meaning to, as he raised one hand, fingers rough and warm as they brushed gently along my cheekbone like he was trying to memorize the shape of it. And even then, I didn't move, didn't flinch or shift away, just let him touch me like he'd been waiting for permission I hadn't officially given, but wasn't denying either. He stepped closer until I could feel the warmth of his chest radiating through the thin fabric of my robe, and I could smell that scent I was beginning to recognize as entirely his. Clean soap, wood smoke, something sharper underneath. And when his forehead rested against mine, he didn't close his eyes. He kept them open and focused so close it made the moment harder to ignore. And in a voice just above a whisper, he said, "You know no one else looks at you like I do." And the way his breath hit my lips made my stomach tighten with something that wasn't confusion, just clarity I didn't want to name. I didn't answer, not out loud, but my hands tightened on the basket, and my lips pressed together like they were holding back more than words, like they were afraid of what might happen if I opened them. And that's when he leaned in, not with tenderness, not with hesitation, but with a kind of urgency that cracked through the silence like a dropped glass. And when his mouth found mine, it wasn't soft, it wasn't sweet, it was all friction, and heat and teeth, his lower lip dragging across mine until he bit it, and the sharpness made me gasp. But my hands had already risen to his shoulders and held him there instead of pushing him away. My voice came out small, unsteady, useless as I whispered, "Don't." but the sound didn't match the grip I had on him or the way my body leaned forward into the space he filled. And by the time his mouth moved to my neck and I felt the warmth of it against the most vulnerable part of me, I didn't say it again, because I knew neither of us was pretending anymore. Still, I didn't move away. Still, he didn't either. We both stayed exactly where we were, suspended between the echo of what just happened and the shadow of what almost did. And it might have lasted longer if not for the sudden crunch of tires on gravel, that unmistakable thud of a car door slamming shut, and the sound of keys jingling as they approached the front porch like a cold wave breaking against a wall already cracked. We separated instantly, not with panic, but with trained precision, like two people who already understood how to disappear into their roles. And I ducked back into the laundry room as he veered toward the guest hallway, neither of us speaking, not even glancing back as the front door opened and my husband's voice called out a casual greeting. He didn't notice anything. He kissed my temple as he passed, walked to the fridge, asked about the coffee, started talking about a patient, and I nodded and answered and smiled where expected. But inside, I already knew something had split, because I wasn't hearing his words the way I used to. And when I looked at him now, I didn't see the man who had kissed me on our wedding night. I saw the absence of someone else's eyes. That evening, after dinner was cleared and the kitchen was quiet and the night had settled like fog around the walls of the house, Brian passed by me in the hallway and stopped just long enough to say, "I won't wait anymore," his voice low and steady like it wasn't a threat but a promise. And before I could respond, he added, "Just say when, and I'll come in." And I stood there frozen, heart caught in a trap between panic and something darker than desire. And I didn't say yes, I didn't say no, I didn't say anything, at all. I stood in the hallway long after his footsteps disappeared into the guest room, staring at the faint outline of my reflection in the framed picture across from me, the one of us in Colorado, snow behind us, my gloved hand raised mid-wave and my husband's arm slung around my shoulder, like he knew what he was holding. Like, he was proud to hold it, like he ever really saw it. And yet as I looked at that glass, I didn't feel guilt. I felt something closer to grief, not for what I'd done, but for how easy it was to pretend I hadn't. Dinner was already on the table when I walked into the kitchen an hour later, salmon slightly overdone, rice too sticky from sitting too long in the pot. But he didn't notice, didn't comment, just took his usual seat and poured himself a glass of water while asking about the HOA meeting I never actually attended. And I nodded and muttered something about neighbors arguing over fence heights as I sat down across from him with a fork. That felt unfamiliar in my fingers. My hand trembled when I lifted it, not enough to draw attention, just enough that I felt the pulse in my wrist more sharply than usual. And across the table, Brian was sitting silently, his own plate untouched, watching me with that same unreadable calm he always wore in the presence of my husband, as if the mask he used around others was sewn too tight to ever slip. I didn't look at him, not directly, but I felt it, the weight of his attention across the flickering candlelight my husband had lit as an afterthought, and when I raised the fork to my mouth and tasted nothing but salt and steam, I forced myself to chew, to nod, to make sounds of agreement, while my thoughts stayed tangled in the memory of his mouth on my throat and the heat of his fingers under the robe I should have tied tighter. After dinner, the plates were cleared without ceremony, the dishwasher loaded half-heartedly, and my husband retreated to his office to finish charts and emails that were always waiting, always piling, always more urgent than anything in our shared life. And I wandered upstairs to fold laundry that didn't need folding, to open windows that didn't need airing, to escape from the heat that memory had left behind. But around midnight, when the stillness in the bedroom got too loud and I couldn't lie there next to someone who hadn't asked a single question all day, I slid out from under the sheets, careful not to wake him, though I knew from the rhythm of his breath that nothing short of an earthquake would, and padded down the stairs without turning on the lights, letting the shadows guide me toward the only place that felt both dangerous and honest. The kitchen smelled faintly of cinnamon and lemon, maybe from the tea I made that morning or from something deeper woven into the wood of the cabinets. And as I stepped across the tile, I saw him already there, leaning against the counter, barefoot, wearing the same soft black t-shirt he always slept in, arms crossed like he'd been there for a while, like he knew I'd come. Neither of us spoke. The silence wasn't awkward. It was deliberate, heavy, slow like syrup, and as I moved closer, the air shifted around us with a tension that wasn't angry or hesitant, just thick with the weight of everything we hadn't said and everything we already knew. I stopped less than a foot away, so close I could see the edge of a shaving cut on his neck, the faint line of a vein in his temple, the way his chest rose and fell in rhythm with mine, and still we didn't touch, didn't move, didn't break the fragile line between presence and contact. Then I reached out, not dramatically, not with need, but with something smaller and deeper than that, and let my fingers brush lightly against his hand where it rested near the sink, just enough to feel the texture of his skin and the stillness of his body as he waited for me to do something more. but I didn't. I let that single moment happen, let it exist untouched by explanation or apology, and then I pulled back slowly, stepped away without a word, turned toward the hallway without looking back, knowing exactly what the silence behind me meant. He didn't follow, he didn't call out, but he didn't need to, because we both knew I would come back, not out of confusion or longing, not because I was searching for something I had lost, but because the line had already been crossed, and people don't step back over lines like that. They keep walking, even if they pretend not to. As I climbed the stairs and slipped back into bed beside the man I had married, I stared at the ceiling until the sun began to lighten the corners of the room, and for the first time in a long time, I didn't close my eyes to sleep. I kept them open, wide and sharp, because I wanted to remember everything exactly as it was. The encounter was passionate and urgent, with me responding fully to his advances, not because I was swept up in some fantasy, but because the line had disappeared completely and what was left wasn't about permission, it was about gravity. I didn't know if we were being reckless or brave or just too far gone to measure the difference anymore, but when I whispered, "This is tearing me apart," it wasn't for effect, it was the truth, raw and shaking at the back of my throat, and his response came without pause, without softness, his voice low and almost angry as he said, "No, it's showing you who you really are." And in that instant I froze, not from shame or shock, but because I felt the truth of it slice right through me like a wire pulled tight, and I hated how much it made sense. I bit down on my lip so hard I tasted copper, because the sound that wanted to escape wasn't allowed to exist in a house where walls still held names and rings and the smell of another man's cologne clung to the air vents. And when Brian knelt behind me, pressing kisses across the small of my back with slow desperation, I didn't say stop. I didn't pull away. I didn't even close my eyes. I only held still, breathing in rhythm with the dryer's hum and memorizing the shape of something that had already gone too far to be forgotten. Later that evening, I was in the living room pretending to straighten magazines that hadn't moved in a week when my husband came in, sniffed the air sharply with a puzzled frown and said, "What's that smell? Something weird in here." And I turned without missing a beat and said, "I think it's just the mold from under the sink again," while keeping my eyes steady on his, trying not to blink, trying not to move like someone who had just burned every map back to safety. Nodded slowly, almost thoughtfully, and walked toward the kitchen like he wasn't sure whether to trust the answer. And I knew by the way his hand hovered over the counter that he didn't buy it fully, but he also didn't press, didn't look me in the eye again, didn't ask anything else, which meant he didn't want to know. Not really. I followed him to the table and watched him scroll through emails while eating chips straight from the bag, and then he held up his phone and said casually, "Oh, I've got to leave again. Got that trip upstate tomorrow. I'll be back in 3 days." And my stomach turned with the sudden jolt of opportunity wrapped in pretend disappointment, because before I could even react, I felt Brian behind me in the hallway, and his voice low and certain. "I'm not leaving tonight." And I knew he meant it, and I didn't argue. I didn't even look surprised. The next morning, I left my wedding ring in the small dish beside the sink, where I used to drop earrings and loose change, and when my husband came into the kitchen with sleep still in his eyes, he noticed immediately, frowned a little, and asked, "Did you forget your ring?" And I shook my head with a light smile and said, "It's been feeling tight lately, probably from the heat." And he chuckled, kissed my cheek, and moved on like it was a joke we'd both agreed on. But Brian didn't laugh. He stood behind him, leaning against the wall, eyes fixed on my bare hand with the kind of expression that didn't need to be explained. And when I turned away, I did it slowly, deliberately, because we both understood that a line erased leaves no trace, only new territory. His breath hitched just once before he answered, not with comfort, but with finality. "Then don't." And it wasn't a plea or a challenge. It was permission. It was a gate swinging open that I had already stepped through the night I let him touch my cheek and didn't pull away. The room was quiet, except for the sound of us moving across, the worn carpet and the rustle of sheets no longer used for sleeping. And I didn't feel the ache in my knees or the guilt in my throat. I only felt the shift in the center of my body, like something fundamental had broken free and refused to be put back. And when it was done, when we lay tangled in the mess we had made without shame or apology, I didn't close my eyes. I stared at the ceiling, breath slowing, and thought only of how long I had been waiting to feel that awake. Later that night, after the house had gone still again, we stood in the hallway between the kitchen and the stairs like shadows caught in the pause between movements, and I reached for a glass of water I didn't want, just to have something to hold, and he stepped behind me slowly, not touching but close enough that I could feel his breath trace the line between my shoulder and my neck. And when he spoke, it wasn't loud, it wasn't hesitant. It was just the truth laid bare. "Your husband is my brother," he said, with no inflection, no weight, just the words alone. And I nodded slowly, lips tight, throat dry, knowing that fact hung heavier than anything else we'd done, knowing that was the moment where we should have turned around and gone back to pretending. But neither of us moved. Then he added, quieter, closer, deeper than the skin. "And you're not his wife anymore." And I wanted to argue, to fight that line, to reject what it meant, but all I could say, barely audible, was, "I don't belong to anyone." And even though my voice tried to sound sure, my eyes betrayed the fear I couldn't swallow. The fear that this had already gone so far that there was no map back to safety, no version of myself untouched by this fire. He didn't push, didn't answer, didn't follow as I turned and left the room, but the silence he left behind wasn't empty. It was full of a truth I had already let in. In the bedroom, my husband stirred but didn't wake, his arm flung across the blanket like a placeholder, and I climbed into bed slowly, carefully, like someone sneaking back into a life that no longer fit, and I lay there staring at the ceiling, not blinking, not breathing deeply, because everything inside me had shifted, everything had redefined itself, and the woman in this bed wasn't the same one he thought he had married. There were no more what-ifs, no more trembling hands or glances turned away, only a path paved by decisions too solid to erase. And as the hours passed and the night deepened, I knew we weren't hiding because we were ashamed. We were hiding because the walls still hadn't crumbled, and as long as they stood, we still had places to disappear. My husband discovered us in bed together during an intimate encounter. The positioning and our state made the sexual nature of what was happening unmistakably clear to him. Like a judge arriving too late to stop the crime but just in time to witness it become irreversible. He didn't speak for the first few seconds, and that silence, those 3, maybe 4 seconds where he simply stood there with the edge of a cardboard box still resting in his hands and his eyes locked on the shape of me beneath the man he had called his brother since childhood, cut deeper than any scream could have. And then the box dropped to the floor with a hollow crack, papers spilling across the hardwood, a bag of screws scattering under the dresser, one bottle rolling slowly until it tapped the baseboard and stopped. Brian didn't move at first, but I did, instinctively, violently, trying to reach for the sheet or pull my robe or do anything that would shrink the moment down into something smaller, something survivable. But no cloth in the world could cover what had already been seen, and no movement fast enough could make me less guilty than I already was. My husband's voice came out louder than the slam of the box, louder than the pounding in my own ears as he shouted with the force of something primal and betrayed, "You, with my brother. In my house." And the way he said each word with such clarity and venom made my stomach twist so sharply I thought I might vomit before I could speak. But I didn't speak, because no string of syllables could rewrite what my body had just confessed. With full honesty, and no performance of regret, could undo the imprint of Brian's fingers still warm on my skin. Brian rose slowly, not scrambling, not defensive, just steady and upright like someone stepping into responsibility rather than running from it. And as he stood to face the man whose name we both shared space with in different ways, my husband lunged forward, grabbed the collar of Brian's half-buttoned shirt, and shoved him backwards so hard his shoulder hit the dresser with a dull thud that made the lamp on top tremble. Brian didn't hit back, didn't resist, didn't even raise his hands. He just stood there with his arms at his sides, chest heaving, voice flat as he said, "You already lost her, you just didn't notice it until I showed her what empty looks like from the inside." And the moment the words left his mouth, I knew something irreversible had cracked in all 3 of us. I finally found my voice, pushed out from the place between shame and desperation, and said, "Please stop," not to defend him or myself, but because the sound of furniture being broken and trust being shattered in real time made it hard to breathe. But my husband turned to me slowly, eyes bloodshot with disbelief and fury, and pointed directly at my chest as he said, "You're worse than him because you smiled at me through this, you kissed me goodnight through this, and you let me believe I still mattered while you were already gone." Then he left. Without slamming anything, without throwing another punch, he walked out of the room with the kind of finality that didn't need volume to be violent. And when the door shut behind him, something colder than silence filled the space. Something heavier than guilt settled between me and the man still standing at the foot of the bed. The sound of the front door slamming against its frame echoed through the house like a final verdict, and even after it settled, the tremor of it seemed to stay inside me, rattling beneath my skin with the kind of shaking that doesn't stop just because the noise ends, and I sat frozen in the middle of the bed, the sheet wrapped around my waist, now felt more like a weak disguise than a barrier, because the damage wasn't in what had been exposed, but in what had already been happening long before we were caught in the act. Brian stood at the dresser where he'd landed, one hand still, braced on the corner like he was trying to ground himself in the aftermath of something he knew he'd initiated. And for a moment he didn't speak. didn't move toward me, didn't soften. He only stared like he was waiting for me to say something that would make the silence stop feeling so final. I kept my arms crossed over my chest, not because I was ashamed of being seen, but because I didn't know where to put my hands anymore. And after everything had been ripped open in one sudden crack, I felt like a woman with no role left to play, no title worth claiming, no belonging that didn't now carry the weight of betrayal too thick to lift. When Brian finally turned to face me fully, his expression didn't carry regret or guilt or even arrogance. It carried ownership, the kind that comes from someone who believes consequences were worth the prize. And in a voice that landed like a cold breath across the skin, he said, "Now, you're mine." Not as a question, not as a comfort, but as a fact he believed I had already agreed to. I stared at him for a long time without blinking, my mouth dry, my chest rising too fast for the stillness of the room, and when I finally answered, my voice came out so low I barely recognized it as my own. "No, now I'm no one." Because in that moment I understood something I hadn't let myself accept until everything burned down around me, that this wasn't a beginning, it wasn't freedom, it wasn't love in disguise, it was simply the collapse of everything I thought I could control. He didn't argue, didn't step closer, didn't reach for me, and maybe that was the first time he realized I wasn't choosing him so much as I had been escaping something else. And now that the escape had been seen, it no longer felt like salvation. It felt like exposure, brutal and irreversible. The rest of the afternoon passed in pieces, not with movement or noise or explanation, but with the thick, unbearable weight of nothing. No footsteps from the hallway, no ring of the doorbell, no sound from upstairs, no hum of appliances, only the heavy silence of a house that had witnessed too much and had nothing left to protect. I went to the kitchen at one point and stood at the sink, not washing anything, not drinking, just standing there with my hands pressed to the cool edge of the counter, looking out the window at the backyard, where the wind moved through the trees like nothing inside these walls had changed, and for a moment I envied the quiet ignorance of the outside world. When the sun began to lower and the shadows stretched longer across the floors, I checked my phone without knowing why, without expecting anything, and found nothing waiting for me. No missed calls, no texts, no angry voicemail, not even a message from the pharmacy or the electric company, only a blank screen that reflected my own face back at me with such dullness that I almost dropped it from the heaviness of seeing myself clearly. Dinner never happened that night, not because there wasn't food in the fridge, but because food is something people make when they still believe in continuation, and I wasn't ready to participate in pretending that anything was continuing, not the marriage, not the illusion, not the story I had been telling myself for weeks, and certainly not the version of me that still wore my husband's name like it meant something. By the time darkness had fully settled into the corners of the living room, and every lamp stayed off by choice, I made my way upstairs with steps, so slow they felt like apology, not to anyone else, just to the floor beneath me, like I was trying to move without asking too much of a house already cracked down the middle. I didn't go to the bed. I didn't go to Brian. I went to the bathroom, turned the shower on as hot as it would go, stepped under the stream fully clothed, and sat down on the tile, knees tucked to my chest, arms wrapped tightly around them, while the water poured over me with a heat that stung my shoulders but didn't warm anything deeper. The sound was loud, but not enough to drown out the hollow rhythm of my thoughts repeating one thing over and over again, that shame doesn't get rinsed away by water, and sin doesn't sting less just because the skin turns red. I stayed there until the steam ran out and the pipes began to groan, until the tips of my fingers wrinkled and the weight in my chest didn't shift even an inch, and when I finally turned the knob and sat in the silence that followed, I knew this was the beginning of something much colder than being alone. This was the moment where I stopped pretending I could go back. The screen lit up before my eyes even adjusted to the morning, and although the buzz was soft against the mattress, the sharp pull in my stomach had already arrived before I saw the name, because I knew what this was and why it wouldn't come with anything gentle. And when I finally tilted the phone to Reddit, the words were arranged so coldly, so cleanly, that I didn't feel the blow at first, only the blank white space behind it. Divorce through attorney. Don't look for me. I didn't answer. Not because I didn't want to fight it, not because I believed I deserved kindness or a second chance, but because I couldn't physically lift my hands to type anything back. And when I tried to focus, on the screen, the light blurred and warped until the letters looked like they belonged to someone else's story, someone I didn't know and couldn't save, and I turned the phone over, pressing it face down against the sheet like hiding it would change the fact that he was already gone. Hours passed, or maybe just one, before it rang again, and this time it wasn't him, but her, his sister. The one who used to call me soul family and who sent flowers when I got promoted, the one whose voice now cracked through the speaker without greeting or pause, asking the question like it was acid she had been holding on her tongue since the moment she heard, "Did you seriously sleep with his brother?" Her tone didn't shake, not even a little, and I couldn't speak because there was no version of a yes or no that would change what she already believed. And before I could decide if silence was a betrayal or an answer, she snapped, "Unbelievable," and hung up, and the sound of the line cutting off felt final in a way that made my throat close. When the phone lit up again, I didn't move, and when it rang a third time, I still didn't touch it. And when it buzzed a fourth, I slid it under the pillow, not to silence it, but to bury the weight of her voice, because I couldn't carry both shame and explanation at the same time. Not anymore. Brian stayed in the house 2 more days, not out of entitlement or expectation, but with the kind of stillness that filled the corners without asking for room. And during those 2 days, we barely spoke, barely crossed paths, barely breathed in the same rhythm. And on the second morning, he stood in the doorway with his duffel bag slung over one shoulder and said without drama, "You're afraid of yourself, not me." And I didn't argue, didn't nod, didn't offer anything back, because what he said had been true long before he said it. After he left, the silence in the house didn't feel empty. It felt sharp, like walking barefoot over broken glass where every memory had edges. And when I stepped into the bedroom that night, the absence hit me harder than any slap, because it wasn't just his shoes or his toothbrush or his coat that were missing. It was the space his presence used to fill, and now that space was clean, deliberate, and louder than any goodbye. I sat on the floor with my back against the bed and repeated his last words in my head, not the ones in the message, but the ones he screamed before he left, the ones I had tried not to memorize but did anyway. "You're worse than him, because you did it while sleeping next to me." And I said them again silently, because saying them out loud would have made me collapse. The next morning brought another name on the screen, this one from someone who used to call me her sister, even though we were bound only by memory and shared birthdays, and the message said everything in one cruel, perfect sentence. "You're not my sister, don't call me." And although I deleted her number, I stared at those words at least 10 times before I did, as if reading them again might soften them, even when I knew it wouldn't. When I finally left the house, I thought I was prepared, thought I had enough steel in my spine to face the world, again. But the first step outside made my chest tighten with a pressure I hadn't expected, and the sidewalk felt wider, the air colder, and every set of eyes I passed landed on me too long, too sharp, too aware, as if they knew without being told. And some of them turned away too quickly while others didn't bother hiding the way they whispered. I walked faster, not because I had anywhere to be, but because standing still felt dangerous. And when I crossed the street and saw my reflection in a window, I flinched, because the woman looking back at me wasn't composed or strong or hidden. She looked exposed, peeled open, vulnerable in a way I had never seen before. When I got back to the house, the front door felt heavier than usual, not because it was stuck or broken, but because every movement required energy I no longer had. And as I stepped inside and let it shut behind me, I realized there was no sound to greet me. No footsteps above, no drawers opening in the kitchen, no music playing through the old Bluetooth speaker that used to sit near the sink, and the stillness didn't comfort me. It made my skin feel thinner, like silence had teeth, and it was biting into me with every minute that passed. I didn't take off my shoes, didn't hang my coat, didn't turn on the light. I just walked, straight into the kitchen like muscle memory had taken control, pulled a glass from the cabinet without even checking which one, turned on the faucet and watched the water run, clear and cold and fast. But when I raised the glass to my lips and let the first sip in, I realized I couldn't taste it, couldn't feel it, couldn't name the temperature, because something inside me had stopped registering the difference between numbness and calm. I sat down at the table where we used to eat together, where laughter had once existed, where arguments had once ended with apologies and shared forks and late-night stories that didn't matter to anyone but us. And I stared at the wood grain on the surface until it blurred, until it stopped being lines and started looking like cracks, and I placed the glass down with too much care, as if noise might break the only thing I had left, which was quiet. Outside, the day continued without asking my permission. Cars passing in the distance, birds flying like nothing had collapsed, the sun moving inch by inch toward the edge of the sky, and I sat there breathing but not living, blinking but not seeing, existing but not belonging to anything anymore. Because what do you call yourself when every label you wore has been burned off by the decisions you made without thinking about the fire? I stayed at that table until the light changed color, until the walls turned gold and then gray, until the glass in front of me had gone warm and the condensation faded, and I never picked it up again. Not because I forgot it was there, but because nothing about it seemed real anymore, just like the version of myself I used to carry with confidence, the one who knew how to sit in a room and feel worthy of being there. Later, when I couldn't sit any longer but couldn't lie down either, I wandered through the house slowly, touching doorknobs and light switches like they were relics from a different lifetime. And when I reached the bedroom, I paused outside it like someone standing in front of a grave, because that's what it was now, a place where something ended, and nothing new would ever begin. I didn't sleep in that bed anymore, not even across it or near it or on top of it with a blanket, because the mattress felt like a crime scene, and no amount of clean sheets or open windows could erase the fact that I had destroyed something permanent there. Not just love, not just trust, but identity, and it lingered in the air like smoke even after the fire was gone. When I passed the mirror in the hallway, I stopped again, not to look at my face, but to search for any trace of her. The woman who used to wake up early and water the plants, who wore her husband's t-shirt when doing dishes, who made excuses for late nights and answered texts with heart emojis, and believed that control was something she owned and not something she was losing by inches with every compromise. She wasn't there. Only I was, and even I didn't want to reach for myself anymore. I ended the day back in the bathroom, not because I needed to get clean, but because it was the only place that allowed me to sit without feeling watched, and I turned the water on again. Not too hot this time, just enough to make steam fill the corners, and I slid down the tiled wall until I was on the floor again, my knees pulled close, my hands gripping my elbows like a child pretending she's hugging someone else. The water hit my legs and ran down my feet, pooling near the drain before vanishing, and I let my head fall back against the cold tile, mouth slightly open, throat raw, but still I didn't cry, because crying would have meant feeling something sharp enough to bleed, and what I felt was deeper, heavier, dull like concrete. My last thought, the only one that stayed long enough to be called mine, rose slowly and settled like dust. I thought I was controlling everything, but all I was doing was sliding further, down, inch by inch, smile by smile, moment by moment, and no one stopped me. Not him, not Brian, not the world, and worst of all, not me. And then I closed my eyes, not to sleep, but to disappear, just for a few seconds, just long enough to stop being the version of myself I could no longer stand to carry.